The grandfather clock in the hall chimed for each dong, a heavy bronze punctuation mark in the crushing silence of the house. Outside, the October sky over the Atlantic was the color of a day-old bruise, and a hard slanted rain lashed against the window panes of Robert's study. My study? Now. It still smelled of him, of old books and pipe tobacco and the faint clean scent of the sea that always seemed to cling to his tweed jackets. For the past 11 months, since his heart had finally given up its steady, reassuring rhythm, this room had been my sanctuary, my fortress, and my delivery room. On the great mahogany desk where he once charted the tides and wrote lectures on naval history, I was engaged in the excruciating labor of birthing a truth I had carried inside me for 68 years. The words on the screen blurred. I had been staring at the same sentence for the better part of an hour, a stubborn knot in the tangled thread of memory. It was not a lack of love that defined my childhood, but a surplus of the wrong kind. Was that right? Was it honest? Honesty, I was discovering, was a far more slippery thing than the verifiable facts and dates I had traded in for 40 years as a history professor. History was the story of the dead, safely silenced by time. This was the story of the living. And one of them was very much alive. Reigning from her floral print, thrown in a suite at the St. Jude's Assisted Living Palace, 3 towns over. My manuscript, all 412 pages of it, sat in a neat stack to my left. I had printed it out yesterday, needing to feel the physical weight of it, the heft of the years I had finally wrestled onto the page. The working title stared up at me from the cover sheet. The Paper Queen. A fitting title for my mother, Beatrice. Her entire empire was constructed of paper, letters of complaint, thank you notes dripping with passive aggression, doctors' prescriptions for ailments that vanished under scrutiny, and, of course, the steady stream of checks that kept her afloat and ensured the loyalty of her court. Her pronouncements were law, but her authority was as fragile as a paper crown. I closed my eyes, and the blinking cursor on the screen was replaced by the brilliant, hazy light of a June afternoon in 1983. The memory arrived as it always did, unbidden and complete, a perfect, hermetically sealed diorama of pain. I am 26 years old, standing beside Robert at the altar of a small, sun-drenched chapel. I can feel the delicate lace of my wedding dress against my skin, see the hopeful, ridiculously in love smile on Robert's face. The scent of roses and wax is thick in the air. The minister, a kind man with a gentle lisp, is saying, "And do you, Eleanor, take this man." And then a sound. Not a loud sound. A soft, theatrical sigh, followed by the delicate rustle of silk. From the front pew, my mother Beatrice slumped sideways. It was not a fall so much as a performance of one. One perfectly manicured hand flew to her forehead as she listed bonelessly into the arms of my bewildered Uncle Frank. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. The minister faltered. Robert's hand tightened on mine. My joy, so bright and buoyant only a moment before, curdled into a familiar, cold dread. The ceremony stopped. Of course it stopped. People were on their feet, craning their necks. My sister, Clara, rushed forward. Whispers echoed in the vaulted ceiling. "What is it? Is she all right? It's her heart, you know." It was never her heart. Her heart was a formidable cast-iron engine built for a long and dramatic life. The emergency was always a fiction, designed for maximum narrative impact. Dr. Mills, a family friend and guest, rushed to her side, but she was already being fanned and fussed over, the tragic, beautiful centerpiece of my ruined wedding. She was conscious, of course. Her eyes were fluttering, her breathing shallow and performative. She whispered about a sudden spell, a dizzying weakness, a fear for her life. I stood frozen at the altar, a bride in a tableau of someone else's making. Robert squeezed my hand, his knuckles white. "Ignore her," he breathed, his voice a low, furious rumble. "Tell the minister to continue." But I couldn't. The gravity of her need was too strong. She had spent my entire life conditioning me to respond to that pull, and the training was too deep. The wedding, my wedding, was now a story about Beatrice's brush with death. We finished the vows 20 minutes later in the pastor's stuffy office. The joyful witnesses replaced by a flustered Clara and a fuming Uncle Frank. Later, at the reception, Beatrice made a miraculous recovery. She held court from a comfortable armchair, recounting her harrowing experience to a captive audience, accepting sympathy and praise for her bravery. I just couldn't bear the thought of missing my darling Eleanor's moment. She'd said, patting my hand, her eyes glittering with triumph, "I would have died first." The rain hammered against the glass, pulling me back to the present. My tea was cold. I pushed back from the desk, the wheels of my chair groaning in protest. The house was so empty now. For 40 years, Robert had been my buffer, my shield. He'd understood Beatrice's tactics with a clarity I could never seem to muster. He saw the puppeteer while I was still getting tangled in the strings. "She's a narrative vampire, Elle," he used to say, pouring me a glass of wine after a particularly draining visit. "She sucks the story out of every room and makes it her own." Now, he was gone and I was alone with the vampire. Writing this book was the only exorcism I could think of. It was my attempt to reclaim my own story before the end of my life, to finally drive a stake through the heart of her fiction. I walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on, my movements stiff. My reflection in the dark window was a stranger's, a woman with graying hair pulled back in a loose bun, with fine lines around her eyes that weren't from laughter. I looked tired. I was tired. Tired of a battle that had been raging since my own birth. The phone on the wall rang, its shrill cry an assault on the quiet. I knew who it was before I saw the caller ID. The screen glowed with the contact name I'd entered years ago in a moment of bitter irony. The Queen. For a moment, I considered not answering, just letting it ring. But that would only result in a flurry of increasingly frantic calls, culminating in her phoning the local police for a wellness check, casting herself as the worried, neglected mother. It was easier to answer, was always, in the short term, easier to answer. I picked up the receiver, bracing myself. "Eleanor, darling, I was just thinking of you." Beatrice's voice chirped, a melody of practiced affection. "Hello, Mother. I do hope I'm not interrupting your little project. How is our book coming along?" Our book. The possessive pronoun was a tiny, sharp jab. "It's coming along," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "Wonderful. I was just telling Mrs. Gablew, remember her from the club, that my daughter, the brilliant professor, was writing our family's history. She was so impressed. I had another memory you simply must include. Do you remember that summer in the Catskills when your father wanted to go fishing, but I had that dreadful premonition about the storm, and I insisted we stay home, and sure enough, there was a terrible squall that afternoon. Saved us all. It's such a testament to a mother's intuition, don't you think?" I closed my eyes. I remembered that summer. The premonition had been a 2-day migraine that began the moment my father packed his fishing gear. The squall had been a 20-minute sun shower, but in her version, the version she had polished with years of retelling, she was Cassandra, saving her family from a watery grave. "I'll keep it in mind, Mother," I murmured, watching the kettle begin to steam. "You must. It's important to get the details right, darling. History is all about the details." She paused, and I could hear the subtle shift in her tone, the gear change from helpful muse to gracious monarch. "Now about the launch party. I think the ballroom here at St. Jude's would be perfect. We can do champagne and canapes, and I'll have them put your photograph right by the entrance. We'll have to celebrate your wonderful achievement." The steam from the kettle was a furious hiss. My achievement, her party. Of course. It's a bit early to be planning that, Mother. There's still a lot of work to do. Nonsense. One must be prepared. I'll make some calls. Don't you worry your brilliant little head about a thing. Her voice dropped into a conspiratorial whisper. Just be sure you write a nice dedication to me, darling. Something from the heart. A beat of silence. Don't work too hard. Need you healthy. I worry so. And then the click. She was gone, leaving the echo of her manufactured concern hanging in the air. I poured the boiling water over a tea bag, my hand shaking slightly. A dedication. Oh, I had a dedication planned, all right. For my mother, who taught me that fiction can be more powerful than truth, until now. The conversation left a sour taste in my mouth, and it stirred another memory, another ghost. This one was harder, colder. I was 34. We were standing in the biting November wind of the cemetery, having just buried my father. Robert's arm was a solid, warm anchor around my waist. Clara was sobbing quietly beside me, and my mother. My mother was holding court. She was not crying. She was past that, she told the gathered mourners. She was in a state of profound, noble grief. She clutched the hands of distant cousins, telling them stories about my father, stories that grew grander with each telling. He wasn't just a decent, quiet man who sold insurance and loved a garden. He was a pillar of the community, a secret poet, a man who had worshipped the ground she walked on. Later, at the wake held in our family home, she stood to give a toast. She spoke for 15 minutes. She talked about the day they met, their first dance, the trials they had overcome. She spoke of her loss, her life, her empty future. She mentioned my name and Clara's only once, a passing reference to the beautiful children he gave me. She hijacked his death. She stood at the podium of our shared grief and delivered a eulogy to herself. I watched her, my stomach churning with a rage so pure and cold it felt like swallowing glass. Robert saw it. He led me to the kitchen, poured me a stiff brandy, and said, "One day, Elle, one day you'll have to tell your side of the story." That day had finally come. I carried my tea back into the study, the warmth of the mug a small comfort against the chill in my bones. I sat down at the desk and looked at the pages. The Paper Queen. This wasn't just a book. It was an indictment. It was a closing argument in a trial that had been running my entire life, and I was the prosecutor, the key witness, and the jury. This study was not a writer's den. It was a sterile, controlled environment. It was my delivery room. I was pushing this thing out of me, this heavy, painful, bloody truth. The memories were the contractions, each one seizing me, taking my breath away, and pushing the story closer to the light. And you do not invite the source of your pain into the delivery room. You do not allow the person who wounded you to hold your hand and tell you how to breathe. My fingers found the keyboard. The rage from the phone call, the sorrow from the memories, it all began to flow. The words came faster now, sentences forming into paragraphs, paragraphs into pages. I wrote about the wedding. I wrote about the funeral. I wrote with the detached, brutal clarity of a historian documenting the reign of a petty, manipulative monarch. I wrote until the sky outside turned to deep, starless black, and the only sound was the clicking of the keys and the steady, driving rhythm of the rain. The phone rang again, jarring me from my trance. It was 9 o'clock. Too late for Beatrice. I looked at the screen. It was Sarah, my editor in New York. I took a deep breath and answered, "Eleanor, sorry to call so late," she said, her voice warm and energetic. "I just finished the new pages. My God, woman, this is powerful stuff. The chapter on your father's passing." I was in tears. A wave of relief washed over me. "Thank you, Sarah. It's not easy to write, I know, but you're doing it. You're almost there." She paused, which brings me to the point. I spoke with production today. We have a slot on the spring list we want to hit, which means I need the final finished manuscript on my desk by November 1st. That's a Friday, 6 weeks from tomorrow. The air left my lungs. November 1st. "I know it's a hard deadline, Eleanor," Sarah continued, her voice softening. "But the buzz is already starting on this. I really think this book is going to be important. Can you do it? 6 weeks. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. 6 weeks to finish the labor, to push this story out into the world once. And for all, the date hung in the air, as real and solid as a headstone. My due date, yes, I said, my voice a whisper. I cleared my throat. Yes, Sarah, I can do it. You'll have it by November 1st. We said our goodbyes and I hung up the phone. I swiveled my chair to face the window, looking at my own ghostly reflection superimposed over the dark churning sea. 6 weeks, the final chapter wasn't just the one I had left to write in the book. It was the one I was about to live. The deadline hung in the air of the study like a sword, of Damocles glinting with both menace and promise. November 1st. The date was circled in red on the calendar on my desk. 6 weeks. 42 days to excavate the last, most difficult veins of memory from the mine of my past. In the 2 days since Sarah's call, a frantic, focused energy had taken hold of me. I worked with the methodical precision of a historian on the brink of a breakthrough, cross-referencing my own journals with old photographs, trying to pin down the exact dates of betrayals, the precise wording of old wounds. It was a strange academic approach to my own life, but it was the only way I knew to keep the emotions from swallowing me whole. I was documenting the reign of the paper queen, and my evidence had to be irrefutable. I was immersed in a box of old photos trying to find a picture from my 10th birthday party when the phone rang. The afternoon light was thin and gray, and the house was perfectly still. I had come to cherish the silence, to see it as a collaborator. It was a silence Beatrice could not breach unless I allowed her to. I looked at the caller ID, the Queen. I let it ring 4 times, a small, petty act of resistance. I took a slow, deep breath, squared my shoulders, and picked up the receiver. "Hello, Mother, Eleanor." "There you are, darling." Was about to hang up. "You took so long. I was starting to worry," she began, her voice a little too bright. I was just in the other room. A simple, unassailable fact. No apology, no explanation. Robert had taught me that. "Don't jade," he'd say. Justify, argue, defend, or explain. It's all ammunition for her. "Well, thank goodness. I have the most wonderful idea," she trilled, ignoring my clipped tone. I was sitting here, thinking about you all alone in that big, drafty house, working so hard on our book, and it occurred to me, I have so much time on my hands these days. I could be a real help to you. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew this tactic. The offer of help that is actually a demand for control. "Oh," was all I said, my knuckles white on the receiver. "Yes, I could come and stay for a week or 2. Or even better, you could bring the manuscript here. I could read over the chapters for you, just to make sure your memory is quite right on a few things. You know, the little details. A second pair of eyes is always a blessing, isn't it?" "I could be your editor before the editor," she laughed. A light tinkling, sound that scraped against my nerves like broken glass. There it was. It's the demand, wrapped in the pretty paper of motherly concern. For a lifetime, I would have stumbled, stammered, tried to find a polite way to refuse that she could not twist into an act of aggression. I would have said, "Oh, that's not necessary," or "I wouldn't want to trouble you," which she would have bulldozed in an instant. But the woman who had answered this phone call was not the woman I had been a year ago. The 68 years of conditioning fought against the 11 months of solitary resolve. It was a war inside my own skin. The silence stretched. I let it. I let her sit with the dead air, a thing she absolutely could not tolerate. "Eleanor, you there, darling?" I took a breath. "Yes, Mother, I'm here." My voice was quiet, but it was steady. "Thank you for the offer, but that won't be possible." Another pause. I could almost hear the gears shifting in her mind, recalibrating her attack. "Not possible." "Don't be silly, dear. Of course it's possible. I can have Carlos drive me over this afternoon." "No," I said. The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. I did not raise my voice. I did not load it with anger. It was just a fact. No. I decided to give her a professional boundary, a wall she could not so easily scale with emotional blackmail. It's a strict policy with my publisher, Mother. The manuscript is not to be shared with anyone before it goes through the official editing process. It's a standard clause in the contract. This was, of course, a complete lie. The lie hung in the air between us. Beatrice was a master of untruths, but she was deeply, profoundly offended by being lied to. Her voice, when it came back, was several degrees colder. A contract? What are you talking about? This is your family? This is me? I'm not just anyone. Nevertheless, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs, the answer is no. I'm not sharing the manuscript. The performance began. First, the sharp, wounded intake of breath, the sound of a woman struck to her very core. I don't understand, she stammered, her voice suddenly frail and trembling. But it's our story, Eleanor. My life, too. How can you shut me out? After all I've done for you, all the sacrifices I made. I thought this was something we were sharing, a celebration of our lives. When I didn't respond, the tears gave way to the steel beneath. Her voice hardened, losing its pathetic tremor and taking on an accusatory edge. You're hiding something, she hissed. That's it, isn't it? What have you written in there? What lies are you telling? You're trying to make me look like a fool, aren't you? Or worse, you're trying to paint me as some kind of villain. This is cruel, Eleanor, do you hear me? 'Tis a cruel and selfish thing to do to your 89-year-old mother who has only ever loved you. I have to go, Mother. I have a deadline to meet. Shh, you will not hang up on me. She shrieked, her voice rising to a full-blown tantrum. You are a vicious, ungrateful child. You were always a difficult, sullen little girl, and you've grown into a bitter old woman. Your father would be ashamed of you. My father would be proud, I thought, a sudden, fierce clarity cutting through the noise. I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting her off mid-tirade. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. My entire body was trembling, slick with the cold sweat of rebellion. I had done it. I had drawn the line. For the first time in my life, I had not managed her, placated her, or absorbed her rage. I had simply said no. The terror was immense. But beneath it, a tiny, unfamiliar spark of exhilaration flickered to life. The war had officially begun. It took less than an hour for the first sortie from her second in coming. The phone rang, and the caller ID read, Clara, my sister. I sighed and answered, knowing exactly how this conversation would go. It was a script we had been performing for decades. Eleanor, I just got off the phone with Mother. Tira's voice was heavy with a familiar, weary sigh. The sigh of a long-suffering martyr who was, once again, being forced to clean up my emotional mess. I'm sure you did, I said dryly. She is hysterical, Clara said, her voice rising, absolutely beside herself. She says she can't breathe. She thinks she's having a heart attack. I had to call the nurse. What did you do to her? The accusation was immediate, not what happened. But what did you do? I told her she couldn't read my manuscript before it's published, I said, keeping my voice level. And you couldn't have found a nicer way to say it? Clara shot back. My God, Elle, you know how she is. She's 89 years old. She's fragile. Why do you have to provoke her? Why do you always have to do this? This was me having a boundary. In my family, a boundary was an act of aggression. There was no nice way to say it, Clara. She doesn't hear no as a word. She hears it as a declaration of war. So what? She cried, her voice cracking with frustration. So you fight a little war. You let her read the stupid thing? What would it possibly hurt? Just humor her. Do you know the drill? Let her make a few notes. Feel important? And then you do what you want anyway. It's easier. It's always been easier to just manage her. It's easier for you, I thought. Clara's entire life had been built around a strategy of appeasement. She lived 10 miles from St. Jude's. She was the one who bore the brunt of Beatrice's daily dramas. I understood her exhaustion. But I could no longer set myself on fire to keep her warm. "It's not easier for me," I said, my voice low and intense. "Not anymore. This book is the one thing in my life that is truly mine. It's my story from my perspective. And I will not let her get her hands on it. I will not let her turn it into another one of her fictions." Clara scoffed, a sound of pure dismissal. "Oh, Elle, don't be so dramatic. You're not writing the Pentagon Papers. It's a family memoir. You're rewriting history. Mother was always a bit theatrical. We know that. But she loves you. She worships you. You're blowing this all out of proportion. And for what? So you can feel self-righteous while I'm the one dealing with the fallout. You're going to give her a heart attack over this stupid book?" The accusation stung, sharp and deep. The word dramatic, it was Beatrice's favorite weapon, a way to invalidate any genuine emotion I ever had. To hear it from my sister was a profound betrayal. "This is not about being dramatic, Clara. This is about telling the truth." "Whose truth?" she shot back. "Yours. Do you really think your version of events is the only one that matters? You're not a victim, Eleanor. You've had a good life. And that was it." The chasm between us laid bare. She would never understand, because she had survived by pretending the abuse wasn't real. Acknowledging my truth would force her to acknowledge her own. "Sorry you're in the middle of this, Clara," I said, my voice tired. "But my decision is final." "Fine," she snapped. "But when she ends up in the hospital, that's on you." She hung up. I stood in the kitchen, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I was an island. My own sister, my only living connection to the girl I used to be, had just told me my truth was a lie. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I braced my hand against the wall. A memory, quick and sharp, as a paper cut, surfaced. I am 8 years old. My mother's favorite porcelain doll is broken on the floor. Clara, who is 6, dropped it. But Beatrice is screaming at me, her face contorted with rage. Clara is standing behind her, silent, her eyes wide, letting me take the blame. It was always easier to let me be the lightning rod. The siege began in earnest the next day. Beatrice, realizing direct assault and her lieutenant had failed, launched a campaign to win the hearts and minds of the wider family. An email from my Aunt Patty arrived first. "Dearest Eleanor, your mother called me so distraught. I know how difficult she can be, but she is so proud of you and this book. I do hope you'll reconsider letting her be a part of it. It would mean the world to an old woman." Then a call from my cousin Stephen. "Hey, Elle, is everything okay?" B sounds pretty low. "She said you two had a spat about your book. Do you know how much she adores you? Don't be a stranger to her, okay?" Beatrice had been working the phones, painting a masterful portrait of herself as the wounded, loving matriarch, and me as the cold, cruel, secretive daughter. Each call, each email was a small, carefully aimed stone. They were all so well-meaning. They all thought they were advocating for a fragile old woman. They had no idea they were soldiers in a tyrant's army. I stopped answering the phone, let the emails pile up, unread. I retreated to the study, my only defensible territory. The house grew quieter than ever. The siege from the outside world only intensified the sacred silence within the four walls of Robert's study. I pulled the curtains shut. I worked by the light of a single desk lamp, the pool of yellow light, a small campfire in the vast darkness of my isolation. The anger and the hurt became fuel. I poured all of it onto the page. Their words, dramatic, cruel, selfish, ungrateful, I wove them into the manuscript. Contextualizing them, showing their origins, disarming them by displaying them like artifacts in a museum of pain. The book was becoming my only ally. The words on the page did not judge me. The story, as it unfolded, did not betray me. It was the only thing that told me I was not crazy. The Queen's paper crown may have convinced the world of her benevolent reign. But these pages, solid with the ink of my truth, told a different story. Late one night, I finished the chapter on my childhood relationship with Clara. The memory of the broken doll, the final damning piece of evidence. I leaned back in my chair, the words shimmering on the screen. I looked at the silent phone across the room, a black plastic serpent, inert and harmless for now. The line had been drawn, not just between my mother and me, but between my past and my future. I was entirely, terrifyingly alone in this fight. And for the first time, I realized I had the strength to see it through. The cost of this birth was the family I thought I had. But the prize was myself. For a week there was silence. A tense, brittle silence that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a plunge into icy water. The phone did not ring. No emails bearing the familiar passive-aggressive subject lines appeared in my inbox. I worked, fueled by a nervous, defiant energy. The manuscript grew by a chapter, then another. The quiet should have been a relief, but I knew my mother's tactics too well. Beatrice was not a creature of silence. Silence was not a surrender. It was a reloading. She was marshaling her forces, planning a new line of attack, and I knew she would aim for the softest part of my defenses, my children. Robert and I had tried so hard to raise Michael and Lily outside the blast radius of my mother's personality. We'd moved to this quiet corner of Maine, put 300 miles between our lives and hers. We'd kept visits brief, holidays structured, and phone calls short. But Beatrice's influence was a kind of radiation, insidious, invisible, and capable of penetrating any shield. She had spent their entire lives cultivating the image of the doting, slightly eccentric but utterly adoring Grandma B, a figure of limitless indulgence and affection who stood in stark contrast to their often preoccupied academic parents. She was the fun one, the one who sent extravagant presents and slipped them $20 bills. We were the ones who assigned chores and enforced curfews. Her campaign had been long, patient, and devastatingly effective. The first call came from Michael, my son, the lawyer. He was 42, pragmatic to a fault, a man who viewed emotion as an unreliable variable in the clean equation of life. He lived in Boston with his wife and 2 teenage sons. And our conversations were usually scheduled, efficient exchanges of information. This call was unscheduled. "Mom," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was his courtroom, voice measured, neutral, and implicitly judgmental. "I just had a fascinating conversation with Grandma B." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "Imagine you did?" "She's very upset," he continued, as if presenting a piece of evidence. "She seems to be under the impression that you've written some sort of expose about the family and are refusing to let her see it. She also mentioned you. Hung up on her." "That is a reasonably accurate summary of events," I said, my own voice turning cool and clinical. He sighed, a sound of deep, lawyerly frustration. "Look, Mom, I don't want to get in the middle of this. You and Grandma have your own dynamic. I get it. But from a strategic standpoint, this seems counterproductive. She's 89. She's convinced you're about to publicly humiliate her. It's causing her a great deal of distress. Is this book really worth all this drama? Strategic? Standpoint, he had no idea the kind of war I was fighting. To him, it was a squabble, a tactical error. To me, it was a revolution. "Michael, this book is not about humiliating anyone. It's about me finally telling my own story in my own words. For my entire life, your grandmother has controlled the family narrative. I am simply offering a different perspective. A perspective that's making an old woman miserable," he countered. "What's the end game here? What do you hope to achieve? You can't win a lawsuit against the past. Why not just let it go?" For the sake of peace. Peace, the word my family used to mean surrender. There has never been peace, Michael, I said, my voice trembling slightly. There has only ever been my silence, and I am finished with being silent. The conversation ended there. At a cold, sterile impasse. He loved me. I knew that. But he had been taught, as I had, that Beatrice's emotional comfort was the sun around which our entire family system was obligated to orbit. My decision to break from that orbit was, to him, a reckless, illogical act. I hung up the phone feeling a profound and aching loneliness. My own son could not see the bars of my cage. The main assault, however, came 2 days later. It was late afternoon, and a cold, relentless drizzle had set in, blurring the world outside my window into a watercolor of grays. The phone rang, and it was Lily, and she was crying, "Mom." She sobbed, her voice thick with panic. "Something's happened to Grandma." My blood ran cold. This is it, the real thing, and you've been ignoring her. The guilt was instantaneous and absolute. "Lily, honey, what is it? What's wrong?" "She had a fall, Mom. In her room, she hit her head. I just talked to the nurse at St. Jude's. She's okay. They think, but she's asking for you. She keeps asking for you. She said she was so upset after she talked to Michael that she got dizzy and fell. Mom, she said she just wants to see you one last time. One last time." The ultimate unbeatable move in her game of emotional chess. The deathbed confession. The final plea. Lily was still talking, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of fear and accusation. She said you haven't been taking her calls and the shock of it all was too much for her heart. Shh. She sounds so weak, Mom. Please, you have to go. See her? You have to. Whatever this fight is about, it's not worth this. Just go. My mind was reeling. A fall. She hit her head. My fault. It was a perfectly constructed trap, and my daughter was the unwitting bait. For a lifetime, this would have worked. I would have dropped everything, driven the 90 minutes in a blind. Panic and arrived, breathless and full of guilt, ready to beg for forgiveness and grant whatever she wanted. But the woman writing the book was not the woman who had buried her father. The historian in me, the part of my brain that Robert had so carefully nurtured, whispered a single subversive word: evidence. "Lily," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, trying to push past the frantic thumping in my chest. "Honey, listen to me. Did you speak to the doctor, or just the nurse at the main desk?" I don't know. The woman who answered the phone, she said Grandma was resting. What does it matter? Mom, she's hurt. And she's asking for you. Okay, honey, I hear you. Let me make a call, and I'll call you right back. I love you." I hung up. Before she could argue, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the numbers on the phone. My heart was screaming at me. What are you doing? Go to your mother. But my mind, cold and clear, held me back. I did not call the main number for St. Jude's. I had the direct extension for the nurse's station on Beatrice's floor. A number I kept for true emergencies. A calm, professional voice answered. "Third floor Nurse Brenda speaking." Nurse Brenda was a sturdy, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had the quiet competence of someone who had seen everything. I had spoken with her several times about Beatrice's medications. She was not easily flustered. "Brenda, hello. It's Eleanor Vance, Beatrice's daughter." My voice was tight. "I just received a call from my daughter," she was told. "My mother had a fall and hit her head. Can you please tell me what her condition is?" There was a pause. I heard the rustling of papers. "A fall." Brenda repeated, a note of confusion in her voice. "Ma'am, your mother didn't have a fall. Let me check her chart for today." More rustling. "Okay, I see here. Mrs. Vance reported feeling a bit lightheaded after her advanced water Zumba class this morning. Dr. Evans had her lie down for an hour as a precaution." Her vitals are perfect. He cleared her 2 hours ago. In fact, she paused again, and I could hear a faint smile in her voice. She's down in the grand dining room right now. It's cheesecake night. She's just convinced one of the orderlies to bring her a second slice. The world, which had been tilted on its axis, slowly righted itself. The panic receded, replaced by a rage so pure and white-hot it felt like a fever. 'Twas a lie. All of it. A calculated, vicious lie, and she had used my own daughter, my sweet, anxious Lily, as her weapon. She had manufactured a near-death experience over a slice of cheesecake. "Thank you, Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You've been very helpful." I hung up the phone, stood in my kitchen, the drizzle still beating its miserable rhythm against the window. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, a final gear clicking into place. The historian, the daughter, the victim, they all coalesced into something new, something much harder. She had overplayed her hand. She had mistaken my patience for weakness one last time. I was no longer defending, counterattacking. I walked to the closet, pulled on my raincoat and my boots, and grabbed my car keys. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that this confrontation could not happen over the phone. I had to face the Queen in her court. The drive to St. Jude's was a blur of wet roads and gray skies. When I walked through the grand hotel-like lobby, I was perfectly calm. The rage had cooled and settled into a solid, heavy core of resolve. I didn't stop at the front desk. I walked straight through to the grand lounge, a vast room with a fireplace, velvet chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a manicured, rain-soaked garden. And there she was. She was seated in a high-backed armchair, a small group of other residents gathered around her. She was holding a teacup, and I could hear the sound of her laughter as I approached. She looked the very picture of health. One of her friends saw me first. "Beatrice, dear. Look, it's your lovely daughter Eleanor." Beatrice turned. When she saw me, her eyes widened for a fraction of a second in genuine shock. And then the transformation. It was the most breathtaking piece of acting I had ever witnessed. The color drained from her face, her posture crumpled, her hand began to tremble, rattling the teacup in its saucer. A look of profound, tragic suffering washed over her features. "Eleanor," she breathed, her voice a reedy, pathetic whisper. You came." I stopped a few feet from her chair. I did not move closer. I did not bend down. I remained standing, looking down at her. Her audience was watching, rapt. "My darling girl," she said, her voice cracking. "I was so frightened. I thought I was dying. And all I could think of was you, and this terrible business with your book. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world with such a horrible thing between us." The silence was thick with syrupy sympathy. Her friends were looking at me as if I were a monster, the cruel daughter who had driven her mother to the brink. This was her stage, and I was the villain. But I refused to play my part. I let the silence hang for a long moment, meeting her watery, pleading gaze with a look of absolute calm. And then I spoke, my voice not loud, but clear and cold enough to cut through the entire performance. I spoke to Nurse Brenda, mother. I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "There was no fall," I continued, my voice level and merciless. "There was no doctor. There was water Zumba, and then there was cheesecake. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if I had thrown a bucket of ice water on her." The trembling stopped. The pathetic, suffering mask dissolved, and for a terrifying second I saw the real face beneath the cold, furious, calculating intelligence of a master manipulator who had just been publicly beaten at her own game. Her audience of residents looked from her to me, their expressions turning from sympathy to confusion. I wasn't finished. This was the midpoint of my life, not just the story. This was where the entire dynamic shifted. "This is over," I said, my voice still quiet, but now ringing with an authority I had never known I possessed. The threats, the fake illnesses, the lies. And most of all, the manipulating of my children. It is over. Do not call me again. Do not have Clara or Michael or Lily call me on your behalf. I will be in touch with you when and if I am ready. She opened her mouth, a sputtering, incoherent sound of pure rage escaping her lips. But I didn't wait to hear it. I did not need to win an argument. I had already won the war. I turned my back on her, and her shocked audience, and her entire paper kingdom. And I walked out of the room. I did not run. I walked, my back straight, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Driving home, the adrenaline began to fade, but it wasn't replaced by the usual wave of guilt and exhaustion. It was replaced by a strange, profound, and utterly unfamiliar feeling. It was peace, a quiet, solid, grounding peace. I had faced the dragon in its lair, not with fire and rage, but with a simple, undeniable truth. I had sacrificed the illusion of a happy family, the comfort of my sister's alliance, and my children's untroubled affection. But I had saved myself. I pulled into my driveway, the rain finally letting up. A pale, watery sliver of sunlight was breaking through the clouds in the west. I looked at my house, my sanctuary. I knew with a certainty that resonated deep in my bones that I could finish the book now. The road ahead was clear. The Queen was, at last, in check. The victory at St. Jude's was a flash of lightning, illuminating the battlefield in a stark, brilliant white. In its aftermath came the thunder, a low, rolling rumble of consequences. And then the silence. For 3 weeks, the world outside my study ceased to exist. The phone on the kitchen wall became a decorative object. My email inbox, a digital desert. At first, the silence was a balm, the quiet hum of peace I had fought so hard to win. I worked with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, the words flowing from a place of newfound conviction. I wrote about my fraught, confusing university years, about the way Beatrice had subtly sabotaged my first real romance, about the birth of Michael, a moment she had tried to orchestrate from 1,000 miles away. The manuscript was nearing its conclusion. The deadline of November 1st was no longer a threat, but a tangible goalpost, a finish line I could see, shimmering in the distance. But silence, I learned, has a weight. After the first week of peaceful productivity, it began to press in on me. It was no longer the quiet of solitude, but the crushing vacuum of exile. I would find myself standing in the middle of the living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the groan of the old house settling. And a profound, desolate loneliness would wash over me. I had drawn my line in the sand, but I had drawn it around a fortress of one. It's great mind to tree, but I had no one to share it with. My children, my own flesh and blood, had gone silent. Their silence was a verdict. In the court of our family, I had been found guilty. The doubts began to creep in at the edges of my resolve, like rot spreading through the floorboards of the house. In the dead of night, I'd lie awake and hear Clara's voice in my head. "You're not a victim, Eleanor." I'd see the cool disappointment in Michael's eyes. I'd feel the panicked tremor in Lily's voice. Had I miscalculated? Had I, in my quest to reclaim my own past, irrevocably destroyed my family's future? The question nested in my heart. A cold, heavy egg of dread. Am I the asshole? The answer arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by the mailman. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, nestled between a circular for a local hardware store and a bill from the electric company. My name and address were written on the front in Clara's looping, overly ornate cursive. A letter, not an email or a text message. A letter. In our family, a handwritten letter signified an occasion of the utmost gravity, a birth, a death, or a declaration of war. I knew which one this was. I carried it into the house and set it on the kitchen table as if it were an unexploded bomb. I made tea. I stared out the window at the now bare branches of the oak tree clawing at the November gray sky. I did everything I could to delay the inevitable. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, I slit the envelope open with a butter knife. The letter was 5 pages long, front and back. It began without a salutation. I have been trying for weeks to understand what you have become, but I'm afraid I no longer can, she wrote. Your performance at Mother's Home was the most shocking and cruel display I have ever witnessed. You humiliated an 18-year-old woman in front of her friends. You marched in there like a stormtrooper full of righteous anger. And you staged a tantrum because you didn't get your way. You should be ashamed of yourself. I had to sit down. A tantrum? My quiet, cold delivery of a single fact was a tantrum. The rewriting of history was happening again, right here on the page, the ink still fresh. The letter continued, A. Masterclass in Beatrice's brand of psychological warfare, now channeled through her most loyal subject. She wrote of our mother's supposed decline since my visit. She barely eats. She just sits in her chair and weeps. Her blood pressure is dangerously high, and Dr. Evans is worried about the strain on her heart. She flinches every time the phone rings. She is living in a state of constant terror, afraid of what her own daughter is going to do to her next. She told me last night I always knew Eleanor had a cold streak. But I never knew she was capable of such hatred. Do you understand what you have done? You are killing her with this selfish, egotistical book. Every sentence was a perfectly calibrated blow. But the worst was yet to come. She turned her aim on Robert. I've been thinking a lot about Dad, and about Robert, too, Clara wrote, and I've realized that Robert was the worst thing that ever happened to you. He enabled your worst, most dramatic instincts. He fed that little voice in your head that told you you were a victim. He never understood our family. He never understood what it meant to put someone else's needs before your own, to just swallow your pride for the sake of peace. He helped you build this wall of intellectual arrogance around yourself. And now that he's gone, you're using. It is a fortress to hide in while you lob bombs at the rest of us. He would be appalled to see how you're using his memory to justify this vendetta. A strangled sob escaped my lips. An attack on me was one thing. But Robert, she had taken my most sacred memory and desecrated it. She was twisting his love, his support, his unwavering belief in me into a character flaw. The injustice of it was a physical pain, a hot poker pressed against my sternum. The letter ended with a final, brutal flourish. I don't know who you are anymore, Eleanor. Mother may have been difficult, demanding, and at times, yes, theatrical. But she loved you. She always loved you. You, on the other hand, have become monstrous. Don't try to contact me or my children again. We are finished. I dropped the letter as if it were on fire. The pages fluttered to the kitchen floor. Monstrous. The word echoed in the crushing silence of the house. It was one thing to be called monstrous by Beatrice, a woman for whom hyperbole was a native language. It was another to see it written in the familiar hand of my own sister. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I stumbled into the living room and sank onto the sofa, the dam of my resolve finally breaking. A tidal wave of doubt and self-loathing crashed over me. What if she was right? What if I had become a monster? Cold, vengeful old woman, lost in the grievances of the past that I could no longer see the pain I was causing in the present. I looked around the room at the photographs on the mantelpiece. Michael and Lily smiling on their wedding days. Clara and me as children, squinting in the summer sun, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Robert, his dear, kind face, crinkling at the corners of his eyes. My family, a family I had, by all accounts, just destroyed. For what? For a book. For a collection of bitter memories bound in cardboard. The manuscript, my precious, hard-won truth, suddenly seemed like an ugly, hateful thing. It was not a work of liberation. was a weapon of mass destruction, and I had detonated it in the heart of my own life. The study, my delivery room, now felt like a tomb, a place where I had entombed myself with the ghosts of my past. I thought of my mother, 89 and alone, weeping in her chair. Maybe her illnesses were real. Maybe her pain was real. Maybe my entire life, my perception of every event had been warped by a cold, selfish streak I was too arrogant to see. My legs carried me, stiff and robotic, into the study. The manuscript sat on the desk, a neat, orderly monument to my cruelty. The fireplace was cold and dark. It would be so easy. Few matches, and it would all be over. The book, the pain, the fight. It could all turn to ash. Peace. I could call Clara, tell her it was done, and beg for forgiveness. I could go to my mother, fall on my knees, and become her daughter again. I could surrender. My hand reached for the first stack of pages. My fingers trembled. It would be a relief, a release from the terrible weight of this truth. But something stopped me. Robert's voice, a faint echo in the quiet room. One day you'll have to tell your side of the story. Elle, don't let her be the only historian. I couldn't burn it, not without reading it one last time. Not as the author, but as a juror. I owed the woman who had written it that much. I owed her a fair trial. I took the manuscript into the living room, away from the accusatory silence of the study. I sat in Robert's old armchair, pulled an Afghan over my legs, and began to read from page 1. I read all day and into the night. I read about the wedding, my stomach clenching at the memory. But on the page, it was more than a memory. It was an analysis, documented with a quote from a letter I'd written to a friend the next day. I feel like I was a supporting character in my own play. I read about my father's funeral and saw the transcript of my mother's speech, which I had written down from memory days later, a cold academic exercise in grief. I read about the broken doll and a dozen other small, sharp humiliations, each one a single drop of water, which over a lifetime had worn my spirit down to the bone. It was all there, my words, my evidence, my truth. It wasn't the rambling of a bitter, monstrous woman. It was a careful, documented, and irrefutable history of a quiet, relentless campaign of psychological abuse. The book was not the weapon. The actions in the book were the weapon. I had simply been the one to document their impact. I finally reached the last chapter I had written, the one detailing the confrontation at St. Jude's. I read my own description of Beatrice's theatrical collapse, of my quiet, factual response. Clara had called it a tantrum. But on the page it was clear what it really was. The calm, steady voice of a woman who had finally, after 68 years, refused to participate in a lie. My actions hadn't been monstrous. They had been sane. And in that moment, sitting in the pre-dawn quiet of my lonely house, I felt a profound and final shift inside me. The goal was no longer revenge. I no longer had any desire to hurt my mother, to make her feel the pain she had made me feel. That was a fool's errand. That was playing her game. My goal was something different now. It wasn't about damning her in the eyes of the world. It was about freeing myself from the need for her approval inside my own head. It was about liberation. It wasn't about her. It had never really been about her. It was about the 8-year-old girl who took the blame for the broken doll. It was about the 26-year-old bride whose joy was stolen. It was about the grieving daughter whose sorrow was ignored. It was about saving them. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the windows. The house was still silent, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was no longer the silence of exile. It was the silence of sovereignty. This was my home, my life, my story. I walked back into the kitchen and picked up the scattered pages of Clara's letter. I carried them to the fireplace in the study. I struck a match and watched as the hateful, elegant cursive blackened, curled, and turned to weightless, powerless ash. I sat down at my desk. The manuscript was waiting. It was not an enemy. It was not a weapon. It was a shield. It was the truest thing I had ever built. I placed my hands on the keyboard, my purpose clear, my heart quiet. The final push was about to begin. The last week of October was the quietest of my life. The manuscript was gone, delivered into the hands of my editor in New York. The house felt empty without its physical presence on my desk. For months, it had been my collaborator, my confessor, my ally. Now its work was done. My work, however, was not. The final act was not writing the truth, but speaking it aloud. The book launch, scheduled for the evening of October 31st at the local Kennebunkport bookstore, loomed not as a celebration, but as a final public confrontation. There was no question in my mind that she would be there. My mother was a creature of the stage, and she would never allow a play in which she was a central character to open without making an appearance. She would not come to applaud. She would come to burn the theater down. The days leading up to it were a strange, suspended limbo. I walked the beach in the cold, salt-laced wind, watching the slate-gray waves crash and foam against the shore. I felt a calm I hadn't anticipated. The terror and doubt of the preceding weeks had been burned away in the fireplace with Clara's letter. What was left was a kind of serene, stoic resolve. I had survived the worst of the storm inside my own head. Now all that was left was to endure the final public squall. On the afternoon of the launch, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom. I had chosen my clothes with the care of a general selecting her uniform. A simple, well-cut black dress, a single strand of pearls Robert had given me on our 30th anniversary, and low, sensible heels. My hair, more silver than gray now, was pulled back neatly. I looked like what I was, a retired professor, a widow, a respectable, serious woman. There was nothing monstrous about the reflection that stared back at me. There was nothing dramatic. I looked, I thought, with a flicker of grim amusement, like a reliable narrator. Just as I was about to leave, my phone, silent for weeks, buzzed with a text message. It was from my cousin Stephen, the reluctant family diplomat. Thinking of you tonight, Elle. Hope it goes well. Just so you know, your mother is very agitated. Clara is with her. It's all I know. So the Queen was preparing her entrance. The forewarning did not fill me with dread as it once would have. Instead, it solidified my resolve. I would not be ambushed. I would be ready. I took one last look in the mirror and in my own eyes. I saw not fear, but a quiet, waiting strength. I was ready. The bookstore, Mariner's Pages, was a haven of warmth and light against the cold, dark Halloween night. The scent of old paper and brewing cider filled the air. A small crowd had gathered, perhaps 30 or so people. I saw familiar faces from the university, a few friendly neighbors, and members of my book club. They were my people, my community. They were here to support me. It was a comfortable, safe space, a small, warm room I had built for myself in the world. And I knew with absolute certainty that it was about to be invaded. Margaret, the bookstore owner, a kind woman with a cascade of curly red hair, gave me a hug. "We're so proud of you, Eleanor," she whispered. "Are you nervous?" Terrified, I admitted with a small smile. But in a good way. I stood by the podium, sipping a glass of water, my hands surprisingly steady. The room was buzzing with a gentle literary chatter. I felt a pang of longing for Robert so sharp it almost took my breath away. He should have been here, standing in the back with his arms crossed, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Got this? Elle?" I could almost hear him say, "Just tell your side of the story." At 7 o'clock, Margaret tapped the microphone. The room fell silent. She gave a lovely, glowing introduction, speaking of my years at the university, and the courage it took to write a personal history. And then she said, "Please give a warm welcome to our friend and neighbor, Eleanor Vance." A wave of warm applause washed over me as I stepped up to the podium. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of friendly, expectant faces. For a single, beautiful moment, it was perfect. This was it. The culmination of a year of painful, solitary work. This was the delivery. "Thank you, Margaret," I began, my voice clear and strong. "And thank you all for coming out tonight." This book was a long time in the labor. A few people chuckled softly. I'd like to begin by thanking my late husband, Robert, who was the first person to tell me I had a story worth telling. And just as I said his name, the front door of the bookstore swung open. A gust of cold, wet wind swept through the room, carrying the scent of dead leaves. The spell was broken. Every head in the room turned, and there she was. Beatrice sat enthroned in a state-of-the-art wheelchair. A pale blue cashmere blanket draped artfully across her knees. She looked impossibly frail, her skin as translucent as old parchment, her white hair a wispy halo around her head. Her expression was one of profound, tragic suffering. Behind her, pushing the chair, stood Clara, her face a pale, tight mask of grim, martyred duty. They looked like a living Peta, a monument to a mother's sorrow and a daughter's loyalty. They did not lurk in the back. Clara, with slow, deliberate steps, wheeled my mother down the center aisle, which parted for them like the Red Sea. They stopped directly in front of the podium, not 10 feet from where I stood. It was a declaration. You cannot ignore us. This stage is ours now. The warm, supportive atmosphere in the room curdled. The air grew thick with tension and confusion. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My friends looked at me with expressions of pity and concern. This was no longer a book launch. It was a public family drama, and the audience had front row seats. Beatrice did not speak. She didn't have to. Her performance was a masterpiece of silent film acting. She let out a small, almost inaudible whimper. She raised a trembling, age-spotted hand to her chest, as if to calm a fluttering heart. She dabbed at the corner of her eye with a pristine lace-trimmed handkerchief. She was the victim, the wounded party. The heartbroken mother, forced to bear witness to her own public execution. She was poisoning them all against me, word by word, without ever saying a thing. I felt a tremor of the old fear, the instinct to placate, to apologize, to manage her. My heart was pounding. My throat was dry. I could see the trap she had set. If I ignored her, I was cold and cruel. If I acknowledged her, she would take control. The old Eleanor would have stopped, flustered, and said, "Mother, what are you doing here?" And she would have lost. But I was not the old Eleanor. I took a sip of water. I looked down at my mother, her face a mask of calculated frailty. I met her watery, accusatory gaze, and I held it. I did not look away, did not speak. I simply looked at her, and in my gaze there was no anger, no fear. There was only a calm, quiet, and complete understanding. I nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that said, "I see you. And I am not afraid of you anymore." Then I turned back to the audience, my expression serene. I was going to start by reading a passage from the first chapter of The Paper Queen. I said, my voice as steady as a rock. But I think, given the circumstances, I'd like to share a short passage from the middle of the book instead. A chapter about a wedding. I saw Clara flinch. My mother's watery eyes narrowed. I flipped through the pages of the book on the podium, my movements calm and deliberate. I found the page I was looking for. I took a deep breath. And then I began to read. I did not read with emotion, did not read with anger or bitterness. I read with the cool, measured, and slightly detached tone of a historian presenting her findings to a lecture hall. I read the facts. June 14th, 1983, was a perfect, sun-drenched day. Robert and I were standing at the altar of the All Saints Chapel. The minister had just begun to recite the vows. I described the scene in simple, declarative sentences. And then I read about the interruption. From the front pew came A sound, a soft, theatrical sigh, followed by the delicate rustle of silk. My mother Beatrice slumped sideways. It was not a fall so much as a performance of one. One perfectly manicured hand flew to her forehead as she listed bonelessly into the arms of my bewildered Uncle Frank. I continued, my voice even and clear. I described the ceremony being halted, the hushed confusion. I read a direct quote from a letter my own Aunt Patty, who was sitting in the third row of the bookstore. Her face, now a pale picture of astonishment, had written me a week later. Your mother has such a flair for the dramatic, dear. We're all so worried. But she seemed to have made a full recovery by the time the champagne was served. I've read about finishing our vows in the pastor's office. And I read about my mother holding court at the reception, the center of attention, recounting her brave brush with death. I finished the passage with the final analytical sentence of the chapter. A wedding is a narrative rite of passage, the official beginning of a new story. By interrupting the ceremony, my mother was making a clear declarative statement. There would be no new stories. It would only ever be her story. I closed the book. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. No one moved. The audience was no longer looking at me. They were looking at my mother. They had arrived ready to feel sympathy for the frail old woman in the wheelchair. But they had just been presented with a calm, credible, and quietly damning piece of evidence to the contrary. Her performance had been dismantled not by accusation, but by history. Beatrice, for the first time in her life, had lost control of the narrative. Her face, stripped of its mask of suffering, was a terrifying mixture of shock and pure, undiluted rage. Her carefully constructed stage had been turned into a witness box. She had been exposed, and so she broke. The facade of the frail victim shattered, and the true creature emerged, screeching and furious. She shrieked, her voice shockingly strong, a shrill, tearing sound that ripped through the quiet bookstore. All of it. Vicious, hateful lies. You were always a little monster, ungrateful. This was it. The public tantrum. The final, irrefutable proof of my book's entire thesis. She had just performed the epilogue for me. I did not respond. I did not need to. I simply stood at the podium, my hands resting on my closed book, and watched as her rage consumed her. The audience stared, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and dawning understanding. Clara, her face burning with a humiliation so profound it was almost painful to watch, grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. Mother, that's enough. We're leaving. She's a liar. Beatrice screamed as Clara tried to turn the chair. She's twisting everything. Clara, near tears, wrestled the wheelchair around and pushed my sputtering, furious mother up the aisle and out the door, which slammed shut behind them, leaving a stunned and absolute silence in their wake. The delivery was complete. The truth was out. I looked out at the faces of my friends and neighbors. I took a slow, deep breath, the first truly easy breath I had taken in a year, and then I smiled. Thank you, I said, my voice warm and steady. I'd be happy to take any questions. The slamming of the bookstore door was a violent theatrical end to my mother's performance. In its wake, a thick, uncomfortable silence descended upon the room. 30 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, their expressions a cocktail of shock, pity, and a dawning, horrified understanding. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of vertigo, as if I were standing on a cliff's edge, the ground having just crumbled away behind me. My family, in the most public and humiliating way possible, was gone. Then, from the third row, my old friend and former colleague, Professor Albright, began to clap. It was not a loud, boisterous applause. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply respectful sound. Few others joined in, then a few more, until the entire room was filled with a warm, steady wave of applause. It was not the applause for a dramatic reading. It was a quiet, human show of support. It was a gesture that said, "We see you. We heard you." In the aftermath of the launch, there was no grand explosion, no final dramatic confrontation. My family's war against me did not end with a bang, but with a profound and deafening silence. The book, The Paper Queen, was released into the world and began a life of its own. The local paper wrote a small piece about it, mentioning the dramatic launch but focusing more on the book's unflinching look at the complexities of family history. A few literary blogs, the kind that champion quiet, difficult books by unknown authors, picked it up. One reviewer called it a harrowing, meticulously documented account of the kind of quiet abuse that so often goes unnamed. Written with the precision of a historian and the bruised heart of a daughter. That was gratifying. But the real validation, the proof that I had not just screamed into the void, began to arrive in my inbox, and then in my mailbox. Letters. The first one was an email from a man in Dayton, Ohio. "Dear Professor Vance," he wrote, "I just finished your book. My father was my paper king. He never laid a hand on us, but he controlled every room he ever entered with his moods, his demands, his bottomless need for attention. No one ever understood. They all saw the charming, successful man. They didn't see the tyrant who made my mother cry every night. Thank you for giving a name to the ghost that has haunted my entire life." A week later, a handwritten letter arrived on thick, floral stationery from a woman in San Diego. "I am 72 years old," she wrote, "and I just read my own mother's story in your book. The fake illnesses, the way she made my wedding all about her, the way she turned my own sister against me. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was crazy or a bad daughter. Reading your words, I felt the shame of 60 years begin to lift from my shoulders. You have given me a great gift." They came every few days, from men and women, young and old. They were all writing from the same silent, unmapped country of emotional exile. They were all survivors of their own paper monarchs. My story, I realized, was not just my story. It was ours. This personal, painful act of vengeance or liberation, as I was beginning to see, it had become something else entirely. It had become an act of witness. I had not just saved myself. I had, in some small way, offered a lifeline to others. I tried one last time to reach out to my own family. I sent Clara a short, simple email. I did not defend myself. I did not apologize. I only wrote, "I am thinking of you. I hope that someday we can talk." Her reply came 2 days later. It was a single sentence. "There is nothing to talk about. You made your choice, and that was it." A lifetime of sisterhood, of shared memories, both good and bad, severed by a clean, cold click of the send button. The finality of it ached, a dull phantom limb of a pain for a relationship that was, I had to admit, already long dead. Michael's response came a month later, a formal, lawyerly email. He acknowledged that he had, at his wife's insistence, read the book. "It has provided me with a more complete context for your perspective," he wrote, as if summarizing a legal brief. "I understand your position better now. However, the damage to this family is extensive. My boys are confused and upset. I will require a significant period of time to process this." What's not an apology? It was not an embrace. But it was not a complete rejection. It was a small, clinical crack of light in a door I had assumed was sealed forever. I accepted it for what it was. The most difficult conversation was with Lily. She called me one Sunday evening, 6 weeks after the launch. Her voice was small and tearful. "I read it, Mom," she whispered. "I read the whole thing in one night." Waited. My heart a stone in my chest. "Grandma B." "She's different now," Lily continued, her voice catching on a sob. "With me. With all of us. Since that night, it's like the mask is gone, the sweet, doting grandmother is gone. And all that's left is this bitter, angry woman. She says horrible things. About you, about Dad, about everyone. It's like everything you wrote in the book, I can see it now. And it's ugly." "I'm so sorry, honey," I said, my own eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry you have to see that. I just wish. She trailed off, crying softly. I just wish it didn't have to be this way. I miss my grandmother. It's the one I thought I had. I know. I said the words full of a lifetime of my own grief. I miss her too. We did not fix everything in that phone call. The wound was too deep, too complex. But we talked. For the first time, we talked about the truth. Was the beginning. As for Beatrice, I heard of her only through the family grapevine. My cousin Stephen told me in a brief, uncomfortable phone call that she had officially disowned me. I had been excised from her will, my name struck from all her legal documents. She now referred to me, when she referred to me at all, as that woman who wrote the book of lies. The news, when it came, had a strangely hollow impact. She had emotionally disowned me my entire life. The legal formality was just catching up. The paper queen, having lost her kingdom, was now simply burning the maps. It had no power over me anymore. The ledger, I realized, was finally truly closed. A year has passed. 'Tis autumn again in Maine. The air is crisp and clean, and the trees that line my driveway are a riot of crimson and gold. I am sitting in my study now, in every sense of the word. The room is filled with the warm, slanted light of the afternoon sun. The scent of Robert's pipe tobacco has faded, replaced by the scent of my own tea and the chrysanthemums I cut from the garden this morning. I am working on something new. A historical monograph on the lives of women in 18th century New England seaports. I am a historian again. The work is quiet, meticulous, and deeply peaceful. My life is quiet now. The phone rings, but it is friends calling to plan a walk on the beach, or Lily calling for no reason at all, just to talk. The silence of the house is no longer an exile. It is a sanctuary. My family, I have learned, is not defined by blood, but by truth. It is Margaret from the bookstore. It is my book club. It is the network of strangers, the fellow survivors who still, from time to time, send me a letter. We are a family of a kind. My copy of The Paper Queen sits on the bookshelf, between a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt and a collection of Mary Oliver's poetry. Sometimes I take it down and run my hand over the cover. I feel no anger when I look at it, no bitterness, no fiery, vengeful triumph. I only feel a quiet, profound sense of gratitude for the woman who found the courage to write it. She went through a great and terrible labor, and she delivered not just a book, but me. I look out the window, past the golden leaves, to the sliver of blue, endless ocean I can see on the horizon. For 68 years, I was a character in my mother's story, a difficult, sullen child, ungrateful daughter, a cruel, monstrous old woman. But her reign is over. Her book is closed. The final act was not about revenge. It was about authorship. It was about seizing the pen and writing my own ending. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I am a woman of 69 in a quiet house by the sea, surrounded by books and light. And for the first time in my entire life, I am free.